It's very typical for websites to use query strings for some or all of their content. This is especially true on larger, more complex websites. If you're wondering what a query string is, in this example on www.site.com, we have a query string of filter equals true. A query string is everything following the question mark. Within the query string, we have a parameter of filter, and we have the value of that parameter set to true. You might use these different parameters to allow pages to be sorted for pagination, to allow people to filter through different content on your website, or you may simply be using filters to track something about that page. However, when you use parameters contained in query strings, this can cause problems for Googlebot. For example, it could lead to duplication. You can view the same page or effectively the same page at multiple URLs, one with the query string and one without the query string. It can also create problems when Google tries to crawl your website because they now have that many more pages to crawl with all the different query string variations that your website might present. So what we want to do in Google Search Console is try to control those parameters and make sure Google understands which parameters they do need to pay attention to and which parameters they should not pay attention to. With all that in mind, let's go over to Google Search Console and talk about how we can manage URL parameters. In the navigation, you're going to find URL parameters under Legacy Tools and Reports. So click on Legacy Tools and Reports and then click on URL Parameters. Under URL Parameters, you will see any existing parameters that have been added in. In the case of this website, we don't yet have any parameters added in that we're attempting to control. And I want to emphasize, this is probably what your website should look like. This is what most websites will look like. You only want to use URL parameters if you're having some kind of problem. If you know Google is excessively crawling certain pages with certain query strings, and that's presenting a problem. Or if you're having an issue with certain query strings showing up incorrectly in search results, or creating some kind of conflict within search results where you have a lot of self-competition happening. When you click on Add Parameter, you can begin by putting in the parameter name. Let's say that the parameter name in this case is filter. We can then tell Google what this parameter does, and if this parameter changes something about the content on this page. No would indicate that the content is exactly the same with or without that parameter added in. That's most common with tracking parameters. For example, if you add tracking parameters to the end of a URL to know if somebody came to your URL from an email or a social media share, that wouldn't change the content of the page. That's strictly used for reporting. So if this was instead a tracking parameter, you could tell Google that no, this does not affect the page's content and save it. But for our filter parameter, this likely does change the content of the page. Next, we can tell Google how this affects the page's content. Does it sort the page? Does it narrow the selection of the page and show a narrower list of items on the page than what was there with that parameter added? Or does it specify something about the page, adding more clarity and maybe changing the purpose of the page? Does it translate the page to a different language? Is this parameter within the query string used for pagination? Or does it change the content in some other way? Since we're using an example of filter, this one will narrow the content of the page. So we'll select narrows. Finally, we can choose what Googlebot should do when they're crawling the website and they find pages using this parameter. By default, you can let Googlebot decide. Note that this is the default behavior if you never add anything to URL parameters. Googlebot will find the page and they'll decide what to do with it. More often than not, that's probably how you should leave the different parameters on your site, because making any changes beyond that can cause problems with how Google crawls your website and what's showing up in Google search results. But if you know that you really should change this, you have a few different options. You can say that Google should crawl every URL with this parameter in it. In the case of our filter example, maybe we do want Google crawling every URL containing that filter parameter because the filter parameter really does change the content of the page in a substantial enough way that the page content with the filter parameter applied is a page worthy of Googlebot seeing. You can also specify that only URLs with a particular value should be crawled. In this example, maybe we want to say that we only want filter crawled when the filter parameter is set to the value of all. In this case, Google would ignore all the URLs with any other filter value. Filter equals large, filter equals small, filter equals cost, whatever that filter is set to, Google would ignore it unless it is set to filter equals all. Finally, you have the most extreme option. You can tell Google not to crawl any URLs containing this parameter. When Google sees that particular URL containing a parameter of, in this example, filter, they will ignore it outright and they will not crawl any of those URLs. This one can really change how Google perceives your website. So you want to proceed with caution before you make any of these choices, but certainly before you select no URLs. Once you've put in everything, you can click on Save. If you have any questions about URL parameters or how you configure URL parameter controls in Google Search Console, please let me know. You can email me at matthew@elementive.com. If you liked this video and want to see more like it, please subscribe. Thank you for watching.